in a world where shadows move in silence and history hangs by a thread. One man dares to defy it all. Ibrahim Traoré, standing at the crossroads of betrayal, mystery, and hope, faces forces that would see Africa broken. Tonight, the roar of the JF-17 Thunder will echo across the Sahel, marking a turning point in the anti-colonial struggle. Before we dive into this epic story of courage, suspense, and resilience, don't forget to hit that like button, share this video to spread the story, and subscribe for more cinematic journeys from the heart of Africa. The runway lay silent under a restless sky. Storm clouds rolled low, carrying with them the smell of rain and dust, as though the heavens themselves braced for what was to come. Shadows stretched across the tarmac, long and unbroken, waiting like soldiers holding their breath. Somewhere beyond the horizon, engines were said to roar, though no one could prove it, and no one dared to speak too loudly of what might arrive. In the silence, men whispered about betrayal, about promises made by powerful nations and broken in darker rooms. Some swore the alliance would collapse before it began. Others believed Ibrahim Traoré had gambled too much, wagering not just his leadership, but the fragile heartbeat of his nation. The rumors were as thick as the storm clouds. Hidden hands worked tirelessly against him, unseen figures who thrived in the void between hope and despair. Foreign operatives seeded lies, sowing doubt even among those who had once pledged loyalty. Old elites, cast aside in the name of revolution, plotted his downfall from gilded safe houses. Every day the air grew heavier, as if the world itself hesitated to choose between silence and thunder. And yet, in the shadows of doubt, Traoré stood immovable. To his people, he was a young soldier who had risen from obscurity, carrying a weight no mortal should bear. To his enemies, he was a disruption, a flame too dangerous to leave burning. He moved through the capital like a figure half in myth, half in flesh, haunted by Sankara's ghost, and hunted by men who feared the fire of change. The hunger in the streets was real, the despair in the villages unshakable. But so too was the belief that somehow, this man could defy the chains history had bound around them. There were whispers of an arrival, of a storm, not of rain, but of steel. The Americans, some claimed, had reached across oceans with an offer no one expected, the roar of thunder gifted to a nation still bleeding from colonial wounds. Others dismissed it as rumor, a cruel illusion meant to toy with the desperate. Traoré said nothing, but the silence around him grew thick with tension, as though even his refusal to deny it gave the story weight. The airfield lay ready. Lights flickering in the storm, its silence unbearable. The ground itself seemed to tremble in anticipation. Soldiers lined the perimeter, eyes scanning the horizon for shapes that had yet to appear. Every man felt the same question crawling in his chest. Would the sky deliver salvation, or would it betray them like so many times before? And then the first faint hum pierced the storm, low, distant, almost indistinguishable from the thunder rolling across the Sahel. Hearts froze, the silence shattered. In that moment, the line between legend and truth collapsed. What landed on that runway would ignite a storm the world could not contain. The story of Ibrahim Traoré's rise was not written in halls of marble, nor on gilded paper signed by kings and diplomats. It was carved into the red earth of Burkina Faso, in the calloused hands of farmers whose crops had failed too many seasons, in the cracked lips of children who learned hunger before they learned hope. He was not supposed to emerge as a leader. He was supposed to vanish into the silence of forgotten soldiers, one of many who fought battles that were not theirs, carrying rifles older than themselves. Yet the soil has its way of choosing. Out of the weight of despair, it lifted him, young and unyielding, a vessel of a fire that had burned in Africa long before he drew breath. To understand his rise, one had to first step into the ruins of memory. The shadow of Thomas Sankara lingered, not as nostalgia but as a wound. Old men spoke of him in hushed voices, as though his name might still draw bullets through the walls. The young carried his image on torn posters as both warning and prophecy. Sankara had dreamed of an Africa that stood tall, unbroken, its soil unbought. He had been silenced before the dream took form. Traoré grew in that silence, among whispers that the revolution had not died. It had only hidden, waiting for new lungs to breathe it back into being. But Burkina Faso did not wait in peace. The fields turned barren under the cruelty of drought, rivers shrinking into trickles that mocked the thirst of villages. Aid trickled in with strings so tight they felt like chains. Families bartered their last goats for sacks of rice that would not last a week. Hunger was not a visitor. It was the air itself, pressing on the ribs, carving the faces of mothers into masks of endurance. Soldiers, unpaid and underfed, returned home with weapons but no wages, bitterness cutting deeper than their blades. The people cried out for a savior, but the world looked away. In the midst of this despair, the whispers began. Whispers of a pact, unthinkable and yet intoxicating. It was said America had extended a hand not in charity, but in defiance of a greater enemy. A weapon, sleek and fierce, a machine of thunder, the JF-17. To most, it was a phantom, an idea too surreal to believe. What business had America in the deserts of Burkina Faso? What possible reason could they have to arm a nation barely standing on its feet? Some called it a trap, others swore it was a test. Traoré himself spoke little, his silence both unsettling and magnetic. In his eyes there flickered the faint reflection of storm clouds, as though he alone knew what was coming. Enemies heard the whispers too. Not just those in Paris and Brussels, where men in suits clutched maps of Africa like hunters charting prey, but within the very walls of Ouagadougou. There were those who had profited from obedience, whose fortunes were bound to the old chains. They did not see hope in the arrival of thunder. They saw the end of their dominion. Their hands reached out in the dark, funding mercenaries who prowled the deserts, feeding intelligence into foreign ears eager for sabotage. At night, shadows moved across the borders, carrying weapons and secrets. Even within the army, loyalties fractured. Some feared the weight of change. Others dreamed of seizing it for themselves. The world beyond watched with veiled interest. Diplomats whispered in corridors, weighing whether a nation long dismissed could truly rise with wings of fire. Neighboring regimes, shackled by their own debts and obligations, eyed Traoré with suspicion. His defiance threatened to awaken something buried deep in their own people. Newspapers speculated but revealed nothing certain. Some called him a reckless dreamer, others a pawn in someone else's game. None could yet say what he truly was, and all the while the people waited. In villages where children's bellies swelled from hunger, they waited. In towns where youth painted slogans on cracked walls under cover of night, they waited. In the fields where dry stalks rattled like bones, they waited. The idea of thunder had become more than rumor. It had become a prayer, a hope carried on the wind, fragile, dangerous, unyielding. Then came the signs that something greater was stirring. A convoy intercepted on the desert roads, carrying crates marked with insignia no one dared decipher. A series of coded transmissions picked up by soldiers at the capital's edge, their signals sharp and deliberate. An explosion at a supply depot near the border, dismissed as accident but whispered to be sabotage. The pieces moved silently across the board, a game no one admitted to playing, yet one in which every life in Burkina Faso was a stake. At the center of it all stood Ibrahim Traoré, young, resolute, carrying both his people's anguish and their impossible expectations. He was not a man immune to fear, but a man consumed by it, forging it into a weapon as dangerous as any jet. He walked through the capital at dusk, where streetlights flickered and the air was heavy with rumors, a figure caught between myth and reality. To some, he was the son of Sankara's dream. To others, the herald of ruin. Above all, he was the question no one could yet answer. Was the thunder promised to him real? Or just another illusion, meant to break the fragile hope of a people who had already lost too much? The sky held its silence. The world waited for its answer. Night fell heavier than day, as though the darkness itself carried secrets no sun dared expose. In Ouagadougou, the capital stirred with unease. It was not the kind of unrest that shouted in the streets or set fire to buildings, but the silent kind. The way soldiers shifted uneasily at checkpoints. The way traders whispered of strange visitors who arrived with heavy bags and heavier accents. The way elders refused to sleep until the early hours, as if expecting disaster to walk through their doors. The promise of thunder had begun to consume everything. Hope was a fragile flame, but in the wrong hands, it could just as easily become fuel for betrayal. The first cracks appeared quietly. A supply convoy, carrying food and equipment for the army, never reached its destination. Wreckage was found in the desert, but no survivors. Official reports called it an accident. The people whispered another truth, that mercenaries had struck under cover of night, guided by someone who knew the convoy's route too well. Weeks later, power flickered out across the capital during a storm, plunging whole districts into darkness. When it returned, a military communications hub was found sabotaged, wires cut cleanly, the culprits vanished. The incidents felt random, but Traoré knew better. Patterns etched themselves across the silence like scars. Someone was trying to choke his revolution before it could draw its first full breath. Suspicion grew like weeds. Within the army, officers who had once sworn loyalty now looked at one another with hollow eyes. Traoré could feel it, the fracture spreading inward. Men he had trusted avoided his gaze, their voices softer, their words less certain. He walked among them in silence, searching for answers he could not yet name. Doubt gnawed at the very core of his command, not with open mutiny but with hesitation. In battle, hesitation was death. Beyond the walls of the barracks, the people suffered. Mothers cradled children too weak to cry, their bodies thin shadows of what they had been. Farmers buried seed in soil too dry to give life. Hunger was no longer just an enemy. It had become a weapon wielded by those who thrived in chaos. The sanctions tightened like a noose, supplies cut, trade halted, promises of aid turned to dust. The whispers spread faster than food could. America will not come. They have left us. We are alone again. In the markets, young men repeated the words with bitterness, as if trying to prepare themselves for another betrayal. But not all voices spoke of despair. Somewhere in the city, graffiti appeared overnight. Crude drawings of jets with wings spread wide, painted in white chalk across crumbling walls. Underneath a single word, thunder. No one admitted to writing it, but the message traveled farther than any newspaper. The children began to chant it in alleys, the word rolling off their tongues like a promise. To them, thunder was no longer just a sound in the sky. It was a salvation they had claimed for themselves. Yet the shadows moved faster than the chants. A coded transmission, intercepted late one evening, revealed a plot more sinister than sabotage. Traoré's closest advisors pored over the scrambled messages, piecing together fragments that painted a chilling picture. An assassination attempt, timed to the rumored arrival of the jets. The airfield would be attacked before the first engine touched down. The enemy sought not only to kill a man, but to shatter the very symbol of resistance before it could be born. Mysterious envoys arrived at the capital in the dead of night. Their faces were hidden beneath hoods, their origins unclear. Some claimed they were American operatives, come to warn Traoré of the betrayal waiting in his midst. Others whispered they were mercenaries playing a deeper game. Their warnings were veiled in riddles. The sky will roar, but the ground may bleed before it does. Traoré listened, but trusted nothing. He had seen enough of men in shadows to know they were loyal only to themselves. Every step closer to the promised moment seemed to deepen the tension. Soldiers muttered that the jets would never come, that America had abandoned them in exchange for easier alliances elsewhere. A few deserted outright, vanishing into the night with stolen rifles and bitter hearts. Rumors spread of gold exchanged in secret, of foreign agents bribing generals to betray their oath. At night, gunfire echoed faintly from the outskirts of the city, skirmishes with unseen enemies testing the perimeter, probing the defenses like wolves circling a wounded lion. Traoré did not retreat. He stood firmer, though the weight on his shoulders pressed heavier with every breath. He moved through his city with the same steady stride, even as mothers reached for him with trembling hands and fathers begged him to keep their children alive. His silence became its own weapon, unnerving both allies and enemies. Behind that silence, he carried the same thought. Over and over, if the thunder did not come, if betrayal proved stronger than hope, then all that had been built would collapse into dust. The night of the landing drew near. The airfield was prepared, but unease clung to every corner. Strange shapes had been spotted in the desert, lights moving in patterns no caravan would dare. Scouts reported unfamiliar tracks leading toward the capital, then vanishing into nothingness. Spies whispered of explosives planted near the runway, hidden beneath crates of supplies. A storm gathered overhead, black and swollen, as though the sky itself sought to test whether thunder would come from heaven or from man. The people waited, holding their breath. Traoré, alone in his thoughts, stared at the horizon as if daring it to betray him. All of Africa seemed to lean with him, caught between silence and revelation, despair and defiance. The promise of thunder was no longer a rumor. It was a reckoning, and the hour had come. The storm had gathered fully by nightfall, clouds churning like an angry ocean over the Sahel. The airfield, lit by flickering floodlights, looked small against the vast darkness. Yet it held the weight of the continent's hopes. Soldiers crouched behind vehicles, rifles in hand, eyes darting to every shadow. Traoré walked among them, unhurried, his presence alone a silent command. Lightning forked across the sky, illuminating the horizon in jagged flashes, as if the heavens themselves were testing the courage of the man who had dared to challenge history. Then came the first signs of the assault. Explosions erupted along the outer perimeter, throwing up clouds of dust and debris. Mercenaries moved with terrifying precision, their guns blazing, their intentions unmistakable. The airfield, a place meant for salvation, had become a battlefield. Traoré did not hesitate. He directed his men with calm authority, every movement precise, every order spoken in clipped tones. The storm and gunfire mingled, a symphony of chaos that seemed almost alive, feeding off the fear and resolve of those who stood in its path. In the midst of the chaos, shadows moved closer to the control tower. Betrayal revealed itself in the form of officers who had once pledged loyalty, now aiding the attackers with coded signals and sabotaged equipment. Traoré saw it, and his mind moved faster than the gunfire. He tore through corridors, over debris, shutting down systems and securing key points before the traitors could act. Every step was a gamble. Every choice could cost lives. Above, the storm raged, but the faint hum of engines reached his ears. The JF-17 Thunder was near. The sound was low at first, almost imperceptible under the roar of lightning and bullets. But it grew, deep and resonant, vibrating through the tarmac and into the bones of everyone present. Soldiers froze, recognizing the sound they had only dreamed of. The world seemed to hold its breath. As the first jets pierced the clouds, Traoré led a final charge to secure the runway. Shadows lunged from the sides, but he moved with unyielding precision, deflecting bullets, rallying men, and striking down those who had betrayed him. The storm and battle merged into a single entity, the night itself seeming to bend around his resolve. Every heartbeat, every breath was measured against the roar of the approaching thunder. Then the JF-17s broke through the clouds, engines screaming with power and fury. Their descent was a spectacle of light and sound, illuminating the chaos below like fire in the night. Soldiers gasped. Enemies faltered. Traoré watched as the jets touched the tarmac, wheels burning across the wet runway, engines vibrating the ground like the heartbeat of a continent awakened. The sound of thunder was no longer metaphorical. It had arrived, tangible, undeniable. With the arrival of the jets, the tide turned. Mercenaries scattered under the combined force of Traoré's strategy and the roar of engines above. Betrayers were cornered, exposed, powerless against the unity and courage of those who refused to yield. Every inch of ground regained was a declaration. Africa would not be broken by fear, by deception, or by shadows in the night. Traoré's defiance had transformed into a tangible victory, yet it was only the beginning. The storm began to dissipate, the first rays of dawn slicing through the clouds. Soldiers and civilians alike emerged from the shadows, witnessing the jets gleaming under the morning light, engines still warm, symbols of something far greater than mere weaponry. The sky no longer threatened. It heralded. Traoré stood on the tarmac, rain-soaked and battle-worn, but unbowed. His gaze swept across the horizon, knowing the world had seen a moment few thought possible. The impossible had arrived, carried on wings of thunder, and still, in the quiet after the chaos, a whisper of mystery lingered. Who had orchestrated the plots against him, and why had some hands moved in secrecy while others remained loyal? Traoré did not yet know all the answers, but he knew this: The world had shifted in a single night, the sound of thunder marking the birth of a new era. The first light of morning stretched across the Sahel like a tentative promise, washing the tarmac in soft gold. The JF-17, Thunder, stood gleaming, engines still warm, a monument to a night that had tested courage, loyalty, and the very bounds of possibility. Soldiers emerged from the shadows, their faces streaked with rain, soot, and sweat, but illuminated with a newfound fire. Civilians, drawn by the roar and whispers, filled the outskirts of the airfield. They came barefoot, clutching children, carrying whatever meager belongings they had preserved, eyes wide at the sight of machines that seemed born from both dream and defiance. Traoré walked among them, not as a man who had won a battle, but as one who had lifted the weight of expectation from shoulders that had carried it too long. He had faced betrayal and ambush, shadows and storms, yet here he stood, the symbol of resilience incarnate. Behind him, the jets hummed softly, their engines still vibrating in quiet remembrance of the chaos that had preceded them. The people did not yet fully understand what had happened, but they felt it in the marrow. A new era had begun, and they had been witnesses to its birth. News traveled fast. Across Burkina Faso, radios crackled with reports of Traoré's triumph, though the details were sparse and fragmented. Neighboring nations trembled at the implications, some in fear, others in awe. It was no longer just a story of a single man, but of a continent daring to reclaim its voice. Soldiers who had doubted him whispered his name with reverence. Mercenaries who had attempted betrayal vanished into obscurity, exposed and humiliated. The JF-17s, once rumored and doubted, now roared in the skies, their presence a testament to audacity and vision. Yet the victory was more than military. It was symbolic, a message etched into the air above the Sahel. Africa had seen what determination, courage, and strategic alliance could achieve. The people, long accustomed to despair and silence, began to rise in spirit. Markets opened with renewed hope, children laughed in alleys long shadowed by hunger, and elders spoke of Sankara not as a dream long dead, but as a flame that had found a new keeper. Across the continent, whispers began of a rising Africa, one that would no longer bow to shadows or chains. Traoré himself understood the weight of this moment. He was not naive. The world remained fraught with dangers. Alliances were fragile, and betrayal never entirely vanished. But he also knew that symbols carried power beyond mere strategy. A single night of courage, of facing impossible odds, had shifted perception, kindled hope, and ignited a narrative of resistance. Where there had been doubt, there was now belief. Where there had been silence, there was thunder. As he looked up at the jets now circling high above, Traoré could almost hear the echo of a question whispered through time, through generations that had suffered, endured, and dreamed. Is this the moment Africa broke its chains? The answer did not need words. It was written in the eyes of the people, in the unbroken rhythm of their hearts, in the rumble of engines that carried promise across the horizon. The continent had risen, not in a single act, but in 1,000 small ones, converging under a sky that once threatened despair and now heralded hope. The wind carried the scent of dust and rain, mingling with the electric tang of engines. Traoré stood alone for a moment, silent but unyielding, a figure both human and mythic. Behind him, the airfield gleamed as a testament to courage. Before him, the sky stretched vast and open, endless possibilities shimmering just beyond the horizon. Africa had been shaken awake, and in that awakening it had begun to reclaim not just its skies, but its destiny. And in that quiet, potent moment, one truth remained. Thunder would not just strike, it would echo. Across deserts, forests, and cities, across hearts long silenced, across generations yet unborn, the sound of resilience, of defiance, of a continent refusing to bow had begun. The story of Ibrahim Traoré and the JF-17 Thunder was not simply about a man or a machine. It was about a turning point in history, the moment a people remembered how to rise.